Welcome to Rejoice family and those beyond Rejoice. Thank you for joining us. This is something new. So I've been working on this primarily for my congregation, but I think it's something that is pertinent to people wherever they are in this particular time. One of the dynamics of having been in kind of this COVID social isolation for the last basically 8 months now is that many of us are either exhausted, grieving, anxious, or depressed, and maybe a combination of all of those things. And so I wanted to take some time to talk about that, to talk about, well, how do we as human beings experience those things, but then also what are they doing in the midst of it. And one of the things I really want to reframe is so many times we look at these things going on in our life. Hey, my body, or I'm physically tired, or I'm feeling anxious or depressed, or I'm grieving, and we look at those as things that we need to just ignore or move past, that they're things that are signs of weakness. And what I want to help us think about is, they're more like warning lights on your car dashboard. So everybody's had the time on your car dashboard where your check engine light comes on, or your oil pressure light, or something. It's telling you something is wrong with the vehicle. Well, so paying attention to what our emotions are doing, just like paying attention to what your body is doing, is important to understanding, what is it that we as human beings need. So I'm going to start with a story. It's a story that Johann Hari tells. It's a story at the beginning of his book, Lost Connections. This is a story of an apple. So he's in Hanoi in Vietnam, and he's working on a book that he's writing. He's working on a book, and he's interviewing people who have survived the Vietnam War. And so he's in the market in Hanoi. He finds this beautiful red large apple, and so he buys that, and he knows enough to know that they use pesticides. They need to wash the apple off. So he takes the apple home, and he takes some bottled water and rinses it off, and he takes that first bite, and it's like biting into Chernobyl. You know that there's something wrong with it, but it's late. He doesn't want to go back out to go and get something else. So he eats about half the apple, and then he's sick afterwards. And he's sick not just for the next day, but the day following that. And the day following that, he finally goes out to an interview. He and his team have gone out to interview a woman who was the only survivor of her village when her village was bombed. And very shortly into the interview, he's just bent over in pain, and the woman looks at him and says, "You need to go to the hospital now." And he tries to minimize it. "Oh, no, we'll get through this, and wait till I get back home." And she's like, "No, you need to go to the hospital now." And eventually his interviewing team, cameramen, people like that, say, "Well, who do I trust? Do I trust the person who's the only survivor from her village that got bombed, or do I trust you, who is bent over in pain? I'm going to trust her." So they take her to the hospital, or they take him to the hospital, and the doctors, what he wants the doctors to do is give him some drugs to where he doesn't feel nauseous anymore, where he's not feel like his system his stomach is turning itself in knots. He doesn't want to vomit or anything else anymore. But the doctors tell him, "No, we need this. We need to know what's going on with your body." And so eventually they're able to look at what's coming out of his body and say, "So what have you eaten lately?" And so he explains that, and, well, was it a clean apple? He explains how he washed it off, and again, so apparently in Vietnam they use so many pesticides that you can't just rinse off an apple. There, you apparently have to cut the entire peel off, and then you can eat it. And so they were able to purge his system from what was in there, but otherwise, if he hadn't paid attention to that, it would have killed him. So I think we a lot of times don't think about mental stress the same way we do about physical stress. You know, if you sprain your ankle, you're just not going to be able to support weight on it the same way as you would um, if you haven't. If you break an arm, you know, it hurts, and people go and they go to the hospital and they get that hurt taken care of, and they do what they need to do to get that right. But a lot of times when we think about stressors and we think about the things that cause us to feel anxious, depressed, grieving, exhaustion, we think of them, well, they're just, you know, we don't take those at the same level of seriousness as we do physical injury, and so we may continue to do the same things over and over and over again. And you know, just in this particular moment in our society, there are a lot of stressors. So there's the obvious one. There's the COVID-19 pandemic and the concern over our health that's been a part of this. Because of that, there's also a lack of connection with others that we've experienced. You know, work and school and church and family and friends, those are all important things, and humans are social creatures, and so we have this emotional starvation that's going on right now, that we've not been able to interact with people in the same way we have in the past. And even if you're an introvert, you need that. People need different levels of that, but humans are not designed to be isolated. You know, we're not designed to live just on our own. You add into the picture the unrest in our society. So you have the civil unrest around racism. You have the election unease, the political unrest that's going on, and again, the political polarization that's not only breaking apart people within our country, but it's breaking apart families, it's breaking apart relationships, it's causing stress, and there is this kind of, you know, breaking to where you have to fit into one camp or the other. There's also the reality that some of us may be mourning lost events, lost gatherings, lost markers. You know, my daughter was a senior in high school last year. You know, things like prom, graduation, beginning of her freshman year of college, those have all changed. My wife and I, we love musicals. We love going to concerts. We've had to significantly curtail a lot of those things or eliminate those things. We had planned a vacation where we were going on a cruise in April. We've been working on this for quite a while. And again, that got canceled. There is a sense to where, yes, you can have everything else going on, and yes, everything else may be right, but some of these things get changed. And there's mourning that goes with that. I know another piece of it is also financial insecurity. I mean, a lot of people have had their work change. Some have had to be furloughed. Some have lost their jobs. Some have had to retire early. And all these things, they're stressors in our society. They're stressors that may be in our individual lives at this particular moment in time. So this first video, I'm really going to focus in on kind of some of the diagnostic piece. You know, let's talk about what these things are that give us grief and anxiety and depression, that make us feel exhausted. And then in the second video and the third video, I'm going to help us kind of move more towards how do we find moments of joy? How do we find happiness even in the midst of those times? What are things that we change to help make our life better? So I'm going to talk about 9 causes of anxiety and depression. A lot of these are from Johann Hari's book, Lost Connections. And so the first one I'm going to talk about is grief. Now, again, I talked about grieving, anxiety, and depression. If you look at anxiety and depression and you look at it next to grief, many of the characteristics are identical. The only difference in many cases is that with grief you have an identifiable thing that you are grieving. You know, whether it's the loss of a relationship due to death, whether it's the loss of a relationship due to a separation, divorce, whether it is a job change, but again, you can identify, here's what is specifically causing this. And within the DSM, for a long time there was a grief exception. And they would say, so for long as you're feeling this way within this amount of time, after you are that has happened, that's normal. And again, I think a lot of people think, well, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and it can, but it also leaves you scarred, and it can also leave you weak. So I think a lot of this is, how do we learn from this suffering? How do we learn from these times? How do we learn from what we've gone through? You don't get to choose whether you're going to suffer or not, but you do get to choose if you learn from that time. Many people are familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. What most people don't know is that she and then and a co-worker kind of came up with the idea of a 6th stage of grief. And really what grief, kind of the end of it should be, is finding meaning, being able to integrate both the joy and the sadness, the gift of that person's life, even though they're no longer here going forward, the gift of a previous relationship, even if it's had to be dissolved going forward. So, grief is a thing that we often, within the work world, we try and set a limit on. Okay, you had a grandfather die, you can be out for 3 days, and then we expect you to be back to work full time. But our human body, our human minds don't work like that. So grief is one thing that is a cause of depression. I know that we, as a congregation, we've had 5 deaths already in the last year. Many of them people who I knew very closely, and yeah, there's grief that goes along with that. So grief is one. Another one that is very common is a disconnection from meaningful work. If you spend all of your life doing the same thing and not feeling like it makes any difference, it impacts everything else, because we spend much of our working life at work, and if what we're doing doesn't feel meaningful, and again, it's subjective. You can make anything seem meaningful, but again, many things do feel just soul crushing. You go into work and you have to do the same thing over and over and over again, and you're not ever asked to figure out why, or to learn better, or to be able to make any real significant change. And again, one of the things that happened in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, where we got separated from working the land, many of us, and again, I'm not going to say this was an ideal situation either, but humans became reduced to doing very machine-like tasks. And while humans can do that, they don't find great meaning in it. And so, one of the pieces is my work feeling meaningful? And it's good, especially in this time where you're disconnected, or work seems awkward, or things like that. It doesn't have to be work. It can be school. It can be projects you're working on. Again, if it just feels like menial labor, the human body says, well, what do I need to do to have something meaningful? Now, that may not be something you can fix right off the bat, so we'll talk about that more in our next time, but we do want meaningful work. We were created for work that has meaning, and the idea, the Lutheran idea of vocation, where it's not just if you are a pastor or somebody like that, your work has meaning. The person who prepares the meal, their work has meaning. The person who makes clothing, their work has meaning. And these are examples from Luther's time. The person who works as the cashier, their work has meaning. They have an interaction that can be very important. So the third one is disconnection from other people. We as human beings were created to be social creatures. One of the things that you can look back throughout history is you'll see that humans form into groups. You can call it tribes, you can call it communities, you can call it whatever you want. But we were created for that, and there's good and bad with it, but oftentimes the good outweighs the bad, because we need to feel like we are a part of something. We need to feel like there is our group. And We have been dismantling our tribes uh, in phenomenal ways over the last 50 years. Um, the reality is that behind the page, the so again, between 1985 and 1984, this is before the advent of the internet. Active involvement in community organizations fell 45%. So that is church, that's politics, that's all kinds of things, but these places where people found meaning as society in tribe. We dropped out of community, we turned inward. And one of the other things they began tracking is how many close friends do people have. So again, at that point, when they were doing the initial survey, initially the typical answer was 3. In the 1980s, the most common answer was 3. By 2004, the most common answer was 0. And I think that there are a lot of people who would find themselves in that situation where, how many close friends do you have? 0. How many people do I have that I can go to and I know that they're not going to ask anything why? Many people don't have that person. And so it's not just all the pressures of society, it's the way that we've reordered our lives to be a part of that. So we have become disconnected from other people, and the internet arrived at a point where we're already feeling disconnected. And again, it promised connection. Facebook, all the Instagram, all the different social media sites, they promise connection, and a lot of times people go there looking for connection, and they find and experience disconnection. And again, many social posts are there with the hope: will somebody please acknowledge me? Will somebody please show me that I matter? So another, grief, disconnection from meaningful work, disconnection from other people. The fourth one is disconnecting from meaningful values. So we know that if you go and not to pick on McDonald's or any other fast food restaurant, but if you go and you eat fast food all the time, that's not good for you. And junk values are not good for us either. What are values that are worthy of the life we want to live? And even in the way we've begun to define that. So one of the key words in modern society is authenticity, and it's not all bad, but we have to understand that authenticity is a individualistic. You have to define what that is for you, and in previous generations, you inherited what a good life was. So again, a lot of times we have these junk values. So consumerism, we use things to fill the void. We use the message you get over and over and over again from marketing is, you buy this and you will be happy. And every religious system ever devised says that's wrong. Every philosophical system that was devised prior to the 1800s says that's wrong. And there's lots of science behind it that says, the more we place our value on monetary things, on things, period, the more we place our happiness into that, the less happy we are. So the first 4 are, the grief that's going to happen to us. We're going to go through grief at various times. Disconnection from meaningful work, other people, and meaningful values. Those may be things that we can impact. Sometimes there are things that happen to us that we can't, that we have to address, otherwise they begin to define us, and that's trauma. It can be childhood trauma, it can be sexual trauma, it can be relational trauma, and there are ways, and people react to those things differently, but we can become very stuck. And again, especially like with childhood trauma, something happens to us as a child, we believe it's our fault. And we begin to push other people away from that. There are people who specialize in working with trauma. There are all kinds of tools that have come in the last 20, 30 years that help work through that. That can be a part of really reconnecting. But unaddressed trauma is going to make it much more likely for you to be anxious and depressed and to have a lower tolerance for things. So the next one is disconnection from respect and status. So, we live in a world that can be very unequal. And again, the more unequal a society is, the more, the higher the instances of anxiety and depression. But we all want to feel like we matter. We all want to feel like we have a position of authority. That people look up to us. And there are different ways of doing this. I mean, and if you are in a vocation and it doesn't feel like your work is meaningful and it doesn't feel like you are valued, and you don't feel like you have respect or status, not only in your work but in your home and in your relationships outside of that, you're very likely to feel anxious or depressed. You're less likely to have energy. So another one is disconnection from our natural world. For better or worse, humans are still animals, and we spent most of our history out in the open. And while you can talk about things like vitamin D and that having an important impact on us, getting sunlight, being out in nature can be very healing. And many of us who live in cities have been disconnected from the natural world. So another part of, and this is an anxiety producer, this is a depression inducer, it's a disconnection from a hopeful and secure future. So again, one of the dynamics that's been working over the last 30, 40 years is as businesses have pushed more and more of the responsibility onto the individual, and there aren't many jobs where you go in and say, I'm going to work here for 20 years and I get a retirement. Those jobs are becoming fewer and fewer, and if you are getting them, they may not be very meaningful. And so there is kind of this whole dynamic of the gig economy, and especially right now in a pandemic, that gets really hard. And again, kind of a clever way of putting this. So we went from a proletariat, a group of people who were your workers, to a precariat. Those who are continually trying to find a way to make it work this week, this month, this year. So there are things in our mind that impact our reaction to these things. So our mind is very elastic. There is this whole relatively new field of neuroplasticity where they're really beginning to understand that the mind changes as it goes through things. And again, there was this whole thing where they were looking at depressed brains, and they began to realize, well, is it a chicken or the egg question? Is the brain looking depressed because the person is in an environment where it's depressed, or is the brain just depressed? And the more they began to look at this, and this is very new, they're beginning to realize that the reality is the brain adapts to being depressed, and it can kind of get in this rut. So your brain can change in that way. There are certain things genetically that can make you more sensitive to anxiety and depression. But even people who have the right genetic code to be sensitive can prosper in the right environment. And again, so my main point of going through all this is to say that a lot of these things are normal, and to kind of start raising some things of saying, why am I feeling some of these things? Some of these things are our environment. Some of these things are the things that we go and do to ourselves. Some of these things are the ways in which we are living. And so if we can start thinking about some of those things, then we can start moving towards how do I live? What does a good life look like? what are some, concrete things I can change in my life that might bring me a little bit more joy. So we're going to spend a lot more time on that in our next session. And hopefully this has been helpful. But again, thank you for watching, and I will see you at our next session.